If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. This episode is part of a series on the lies of productivity. When I say lie, I mean a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of what we're doing and how to best approach it. But these things are pushed at us so hard, and the challenges we face are so severe and growing that it feels like we're moving further and further away from what our situation actually should be. So I call them lies. In each of these episodes, I'll state a common belief about our work or our productivity, and then talk about the facts of why it just ain't so. A common quote attributed to Mark Twain, in error, probably, is, "It's not what you don't know that kills you, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So this series is an attempt to move through those misunderstandings. So once I've talked about what the common belief is, I'll talk about a more realistic mindset. And in most cases, practical steps to address the situation from that new mindset. So here we go. Let's start breaking down the lies. Here's one lie. Your productivity is your boss's job. You don't have to worry about your productivity if you're an employee. The boss defines your work and gives it to you in such a way that your value to the organization is high and continues to grow. We think that our bosses have our productivity as a primary concern. At the outset, I will say that I'm talking about employees here because I think that self-employed people are more focused on their own productivity, and while they may not know exactly how to improve it, that they don't tend to fall prey to this particular lie quite as much, simply because they don't have a boss. They have customers. Now, where they might fall into this productivity trap is dealing with a specific customer at a specific time who has a big project that they need done by the self-employed individual. So maybe contractors are somewhere in the middle in falling prey to this particular lie. We'll talk about a few different topics here. So the first is, what do bosses think and why do they think that? And that'll lead us into some discussion of the history of organizations, because the history of management thought and the history of organizations grew up together and went through some changes, some of which we've thought through and adapted to, recovered from, others of which we haven't. But regardless, knowledge work has changed all of that, and I'll explain why that is as we go on through. I'll talk about some symptoms that we're not managing ourselves and our own productivity well enough, and we'll discuss how that manifests itself in your life so you know what to look for to determine whether you're pretty good at this or whether you might need some help and some further thought, whether you need to change your mindset. We'll talk about what the new mindset is and the results that the mindset can produce. And we'll wrap up with talking about tools you may need to consider in order to effectively manage your own productivity. So let's get started. The problem is, when we think about our productivity and how to manage our tasks such that we're the most productive we can be, we tend to think that bosses give us work with our productivity in mind, and thus we don't need to worry about our own productivity. And I'm going to argue that probably bosses don't really think that way. The best bosses want to think that way, but many bosses don't think that way. Knowledge work is a big factor here, and you'll find that I often talk about knowledge work and how the environment has changed and what that means in managerial thought and organizational thought and thought as a worker. And I've covered that in other episodes, notably episode 2, we talk a good bit about what knowledge work is, and we categorize it into different types of knowledge work. In that episode, I even talk about where AI begins to fit in, at least at the present day. but that's where we start defining knowledge work. But we'll talk just a little bit about what it is. So knowledge work is work that's done with your brain as compared to done with your hands or your muscles or physical work in the world. And there's overlap. Artists do their work with their hands and their muscles, but they are also very much knowledge workers. And so most people have a little bit of overlap, but almost every modern job has some component of knowledge work. In many cases, our jobs are almost completely knowledge work as we get to this part of the evolution of work. Our problem stems from the fact that organizations and managerial thought grew up together. And that goes all the way back to the earliest organizations. Our thought begins when we think about organizational work in terms of large organizations and factories, because small organizations didn't get studied as much. Not only did managerial thought evolve as organizations evolved, but our notions of work went right along with that. Bosses have typically had the job of telling employees what to do, and employees have typically had the job of looking to their boss for instructions. We'll talk about the evolution of that thought as well as how our more recent innovations in work have changed the basis for that thought. So when we talk about the evolution of organizations in this sense, we'll go back to a couple of defining moments. 250 years ago, Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations that you may be familiar with. In that book, he summarized thinking on the specialization of labor. People consider whether or not he's the originator of this thinking, and he's probably not. He's probably more the analyst and recorder of this line of thinking, and he's suggesting that more people consider doing their work this way. I'll use Adam Smith to represent that entire line of thought, which probably started at least 100 years before he penned his great work, The Wealth of Nations. But he talked about specialization, and he used the metaphor of a pen factory, and he explained that it's probably more efficient for people to take a part of a manufacturing process, have the proper tools for that, and repetitive skill at doing that one part of the operation than it is for somebody to craft an entire pen. So we'll look at the example a little more closely. The way pens were made at the time is metal was turned into wire, wire was cut into pen length. The one end was sharpened so that the pen would work. The other end had a pin head attached to it, and that way you could push it in, and then pens were typically stuck into pieces of paper in lots of 10 or 50 or whatever it was, so that they could be sold easily. Adam Smith talked about the fact that if we can divide up these functions into smaller pieces, that would enhance the productivity of the organization. The mechanisms that he described and that make sense for this is if you're cutting the wire to the proper length for a pen, then you get very good at operating a particular set of tools. You're not switching between tools or switching between tasks. So if your job is to cut long wire into shorter bits, then it's push it, clip it, push it, clip it, push it, clip it. And that's more productive than grab the wire, pick up the tool, clip it to the right length, grab that, sharpen it, sharpen it, sharpen it, grab the other end, heat it, attach the pen head, stick it into a piece of paper, and move on. Now, again, this was not, at this point, a tremendous innovation. He didn't invent the idea, but he did record it and report it. Well, what that means in organizations is that jobs got cut up into smaller pieces. And so people no longer thought of themselves as pen makers, they thought of themselves as wire cutters. And so the work slipped down into smaller and smaller pieces, which constrained the work itself. So the person that sharpened the pens depended on the person who cut the wire to the right length. because if the person cutting the wire to the right length cut them too short, then the sharpening operation was wasted labor because we'd have to throw that pin away because it's too short. And that evolved into other notions of efficiency across the factory floor. The other big piece that happened in this area of management and work was factories in the Industrial Revolution. And I use Henry Ford as our placekeeper for this, although lots of people invented lots of things in factories. The point of Henry Ford's assembly line automobile production was to begin to introduce tools and machines. So if you think about it, maybe there's three different kinds of production. So there's individual laborers, think a blacksmith that builds an output, a horseshoe, and he handles everything from melting down the metal to shaping it into the right place or into the right shape, bending it and hammering it, to finishing it, taking off the rough edges, to hanging it up in a shop and managing the cash transaction for this whole process. So that's the first, is individual labor and individual expertise. The second is this division of labor, where we're still doing manual labor, but different people are doing different parts of the process. The third is machinery, and machinery began to, by itself, pull in wire, cut it to the right length, and push it into a bucket. So a human didn't have to do that. And the fourth, and closely related to machinery, is robots that are more sophisticated in their ability to handle and manipulate things, and thus can do more complex manipulations of the product that at earlier points in factory were reserved for human people because of the flexibility of a human in being able to perform different operations. The point here is, in Henry Ford's factory, that specialization was really reinforced, because not only did each person have a component that they needed to build and be responsible for, but also those components moved on in the process relatively automatically. The subsequent operation to your operation depended on you doing things in specific ways, not terribly dissimilar from the pen factory, but just maybe a little bit more exaggerated in terms of doing stuff a little bit oddly, and then downstream that causes a problem. When we think about the factory, I envision a huge machine or a huge piece of technology, and I'm talking about the whole factory here, where at one end it takes in raw materials, and there may be hundreds of different raw materials or different inputs that are manufactured somewhere else. But all these things come in one end of this giant factory / machine, and out the other end comes a finished automobile, let's say, for this example. As the different parts of the process happen, if a machine could be created to do it, or a specific tool could be enhanced in such a way as to make a person's job easier, they did that. And the idea was to substitute tools and machines for human labor. A couple of different reasons to do this. People are expensive, they get tired, they sometimes get sick and have motivational problems, they sometimes quit jobs, all these different things, and machines are more predictable and controllable. But what happened with human labor in this scenario is that it became very tightly defined. So imagine that you have the job of putting wheels on one of Henry Ford's cars, tires and wheels. So you get a car that has the axle, and you got a tire, and you pick up the tire and you put it on there, and then you put on lug nuts, right? And then you tighten the lug nuts, and then the car moves on to the next step, whatever that might be. The efficient, seamless movement of the factory as a huge machine depended on the person who was putting on the lug nuts being able to do it. It was tightly defined how they would do what they needed to do. As an example of this tight definition, there was a period of time that they had where they had to get all 5 lug nuts straight because the car would move on. There were specific lug nut patterns. A specific number of cars came through in a shift or in a day. A person needed to be able to do this operation a specific number of times because a specific number of cars would come by. And at the time, that constituted productivity. The most interesting difference, perhaps, is that you could not do more than what was needed. You didn't want to do less. If your job was to put 100 tires on 100 cars, you'd do the lug nut operation 500 times a day. Well, you didn't want to do it 499 times a day, but you also couldn't do it 501 times a day. And so it was very tightly controlled. The job and the output was very tightly controlled. The reason this is important is because the motivation to do the work became an issue, at least in management thought. People would not be able to do the operation, or people would be sick and come to work anyway, or whatever that looked like. There would be other constraints, and they wouldn't put enough lug nuts on enough tires, and this was defined as poor productivity. Well, as that goes on and on and on, people get fired. But in the interim, there was lots of discussion about motivation as a factor. Are people motivated? Do they have the mental skill and strength to work for 8 hours, which is 640 minutes, putting on a little bit less than 1 lug nut per minute for an 8-hour shift? Did they get tired? Did their muscles get tired? Did they get distracted and forget to pick up the lug nut? All these different ideas. But the primary focus of management at that time was motivation. It was, how can we motivate people to do this job? As organizations have evolved and managerial thought has evolved and jobs have become less tightly structured, we've also learned that motivation is not the only problem, but also skills present a challenge. And now we need to define the difference between a motivational problem and a skill problem. And I'll illustrate what that looks like with an example perhaps a little later. Adam Smith talked about specialization. Henry Ford in the factory talked about defining the job. It was a very tightly defined job in most cases. Do this 500 times a day. The military was also a big force in management thought, because the military is asking people to do things that are dangerous. Stand in a line, and when the sergeant says shoot, you shoot, but you wait until the sergeant says shoot to do any shooting. You're not hiding behind things. You're marching up in a big line, and the other army shoots at you, and then you shoot at them. And this just goes back and forth. And so the military was very focused on motivation and how do you get a human being to walk into lethal danger. And that also bled into managerial thought and kind of into the factory model, in the sense that, well, if you don't want to stand in the line, then that's a motivational problem. It's not a skill problem. In the military, that is, if you won't march in the face of other people's guns, it's not because you can't march, it's because you don't want to march and you're not motivated to do that. So early attempts at management were very much oriented towards motivation and lack of motivation, and how do we get people to do what we want them to do when they'd rather do something else. And different methodologies were put into play to solve this problem, or to try to solve it, but that was the focus. And that was related to the specialization of labor and this tight definition of a job. A blacksmith, for example, who did this whole process, didn't have a boss probably, and nobody was really concerned about their motivation, because they had to sell horseshoes in order to eat. And if they didn't sell horseshoes, they didn't eat, and it just wasn't anybody else's problem. Maybe your town didn't wind up with a blacksmith, and that was sort of a problem, but it really wasn't anybody else's concern what the blacksmith did and how well he ate and kind of these ideas. We get into these large organizations, and the military and factories are the earliest examples of this. Train companies having to keep the trains running, they got to be big companies, and several others. But the clearest definition is this factory and how tightly the work was controlled. And then we talked about, productivity is not simple. It's not just motivation. So the Crucial Skills folks who wrote the book Crucial Conversations, which I highly recommend, but they've written other really good knowledge pieces. They talk about how motivation is not the only source of not working. They look at personal motivation versus personal skill, and they advance the idea that if you're not skilled at something, then you may be less willing to invest in doing. Well, we see this in our own lives, which is if I look at a task that I know I'm not very good at, well, I probably feel like I don't enjoy the task. I'm probably less apt to do it, but in the sense that I'm more apt to procrastinate on it rather than just picking it up and doing it. But the Crucial Skills folks look into this situation and they go, when you see somebody in your organization not doing, in your view, what you think they should be doing, you have to be very careful about wondering whether it's a motivation problem or a skill problem. It's easy to think that it's just a motivation problem. One of the primary reasons that it's easy to think it's just a motivation problem is often we get our managerial thought from raising kids, or at least our child rearing process informs our management style. And the story here is my kids and cutting the grass. Time came to cut the grass. They weren't motivated to cut the grass. They'd rather be doing just about anything other than cutting the grass, and had not yet developed the self-discipline to understand that, well, things just need to be done. And, you got to grit your teeth sometimes and do it. Highlighting the motivation to do something versus the skill to do something and how they overlap. So one of the things that I swear my kids did, and I didn't actually witness this and they didn't talk about it. We've talked about it since, but when they had to go out and cut the grass, the first thing they did is look for a reasonable explanation for why the grass could not be cut right now. And a big target of their reasoning was, is the mower working? Because if the mower's not working, if the mower's broken, then clearly I can't be expected to cut grass. And they figured this out pretty early. My vision still is that step one of getting the kids to go mow the grass, well, step one was putting up with the complaining and the, why do I have to do it now? Step two was to go down and inspect the lawnmower to see if there was some reasonable explanation for why the mower couldn't work. It's easy to envision the kids going down there and, giving the mower starter one pull and it doesn't start, and they come trooping back in and go, well, I can't cut the grass because the mower wouldn't start, which is the overlap of this skill. Oh, and the other part of that is, and I can't be expected to fix the mower. I simply don't know how. And all this together made in their minds for this really good excuse for not cutting. In factory work, it was simplified to the point where, at least they thought, almost any human could do the task in question. I mean, there was a certain level of strength required, or perhaps some level of technical skill. But if we think back to our lug nut operator, most every human is capable of this motion, screwing it on, and then this motion and getting it tight. And maybe there's a tool, that helps them. But if we are not motivated to do something, and we can then come back and blame our skill, our lack of skill, then that's a reasonable excuse to not do it. And so the two things do overlap. Factory work allowed managers to focus almost solely on the motivational aspect of that. because of the way the job was constructed. When we think about managerial thought, it has evolved over time, but it has not evolved as fast as the work environment has evolved. I'm sorry. And many bosses still, and this is probably human nature, in the fundamental attribution error, and we'll talk about that in another episode. We tend to immediately think when other people are not doing something that it's a motivational problem. They don't want to, so they're not gonna. And so we attack the motivation. And again, the crucial skills folks talk a lot about this, where in fact, the problem might be a skill problem. And as enlightened managers, and particularly knowledge work managers, we need to be thinking about the fact that, well, maybe they don't have the skill, and how lack of skill will interact with motivation to inhibit someone's interest or ability in carrying out a task. A brief history of organizational/managerial thought has brought us to the point where bosses tend to think they need to tell employees what to do, and employees tend to think that bosses will tell them what to do. And both think that if they've operated under these constraints, that they've satisfied their job, that they've satisfied the social contract of the boss-employee relationship. And in the past, that may have been more true than it is now. And what we face is the evolution of knowledge work. And I mentioned this earlier. I mentioned episode 2 where we talk about knowledge work. But the thing that happened with knowledge work is there's a couple of effects, really. One is you can observe physical labor and you can count the number of lug nuts on a car. And so there's this notion of, are you visibly working is one. And then the other is, okay, yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lug nuts. I see 5 lug nuts. Do you see 5 lug nuts? It's a fact that there are 5 lug nuts. So the notion of quality is a little bit better defined in physical labor often than it is in knowledge work. So the knowledge work phenomenon has always been with us, but it really took over in the late 1900s and is the, I would say, dominant mode of work as we record this in the modern era. When we look at knowledge work, we can't observe it happening. When I'm thinking about problem solving and applying knowledge to a problem, or how to phrase a certain part of knowledge, or how to utilize knowledge against a previously developed set of information, it's very difficult to distinguish whether I'm thinking about the business problem that I need to solve or whether I'm thinking about a personal problem that I need to solve, because they both look a lot like this. So that means that our actual work, our output is observable, but our actual work process is not. If you think back to a factory, the actual work process is observable. You can watch somebody, you can time them on doing the task that they need to do. Where knowledge work, that's not the case. So it's much more difficult to gauge progress, for example, in knowledge work than it is to gauge progress in physical work, typically. So we've got this unobservable work, and then we also have questions about the quality of knowledge work outputs. Is this the best work you can do? So think about a marketing proposal, and we're going to do an ad. And the people who create ads look at this output and they go, well, that's a pretty good ad. Well, is that a 95 on 100 scale, or is that a 72 on 100 scale? How close to the ideal ad have we gotten here? And it's very difficult to determine the quality of that output. So the managerial problem becomes one of, are people slacking? And slacking is the economic term for working at less than their full capacity. So can I take shortcuts that hurt quality, but that make it easier for me to take long breaks during my work? Since it's unobservable, we can't observe whether or not people are taking breaks from their task. And all of this has to do with organizational productivity. So managers have this real challenge when it comes to knowledge work. So one is the nature of the work, and two is the mindset that most managers have, most bosses have, about the fact that if something is not done, it's usually a motivational problem. From these perspectives, it's very difficult for the boss to manage one's productivity. Okay, so that's the first two reasons, and I'll give you a third. In the knowledge work world, the notion is that the boss wants to hire somebody who is smarter than they are. In other words, who knows the specialty better than the boss knows it. Because the boss can't specialize in marketing, can't specialize in accounting, doesn't have time because the boss is managing multiple functions and thus does not have the brain space or the time to become an expert in all of them, but we still want expertise at each one of these levels. When it comes to hiring somebody that's smarter than you, that's great in theory, but the whole thing goes sideways if you then try to tell that person who is smarter than you exactly how to do the work, because then the person that's doing the work is functionally no smarter than the boss that's managing the work. As an example, my wife is a very good cook. So if I, as the leader in the house, walk into the kitchen and go, well, you need to be cooking that apple pie faster, so don't spend so much time rolling out the dough. Have you ever heard something similar to this from a boss that you've had? You're wasting time rolling out that dough so much. We need to get on to making the pie. Well, my wife is the expert, and she knows how much pie dough needs to be rolled out. I'm not the expert. I need to let her decide that. But if I'm trying to manage productivity, then I'm going to oftentimes reduce the quality of the output, which is not directly observable anyway. It's hard to measure the quality of the output. So bosses are caught in this challenging situation of being responsible for the productivity of the people in their organization without the tools of measuring, observing, getting quality straight, these kinds of ideas. The way all this boils down is into managerial thought, which is back to this lie that the boss can manage your productivity. At the end of the day, as your proportion of knowledge work in your job increases, you increasingly have to manage your own productivity. You have to define your own work, realizing that the overall productivity of the organization is influenced to some degree by your own productivity. So I argue then that knowledge workers need to take on the management of their own productivity. It's difficult to do this in modern organizations. Back to this notion that the boss cannot observe motivation versus skill, and the boss cannot observe slacking. If you're going to, as a knowledge worker, manage your own productivity, you need to build a very close relationship with your boss, a trusting relationship. A relationship where both parties understand that the goals of the two parties involved are similar and that they're both exercising equal effort towards those goals. So bosses, based on the mindset that came up through factory and military, know they need to specialize and know they need to hire people that are smarter than they are, but still have lingering questions about whether or not the people that are smarter than they are doing the best job they can do, or being as efficient as they can be. Now let's talk briefly about symptoms of the problem that you may see if you're not managing your own productivity. One is you're going to be frustrated about your ability to produce the right results. And the more of an expert you are in your own specialty, the more frustrated you're going to be about your work process being controlled such that you don't produce the results you want to produce. Going back to the example of my wife and her apple pie, if I, the boss, say, hey, I'd like to have an apple pie for Sunday. And she says, I'm happy to do that. And I go, well, I want apple pie, but there's not enough budget. There's not enough grocery budget to buy sugar. So, make me an apple pie, but hey, we're lacking sugar. Well, that constraint is going to cause her to produce less than her best apple pie, and she takes great pride in her apple pie. Therefore, the fact that the constraint hurts the quality of her output is going to be very frustrating to her. So one of the symptoms that you're not managing your own productivity well is your own sense of frustration about the quality of your results. That's something that needs to be managed because quality does have cost, and perhaps your organization can't afford your time to produce a particular level of quality, but you need to be having a conversation about that with your boss. Another primary symptom is that you then begin to believe that this sort of stress is natural and it's just part of the nature of things, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So you just accept it. So over time, this stress begins to negatively impact your productivity. We know that particularly in a knowledge workspace, stress is not good for productivity, despite what many people say. I talk to a lot of people who say, I do my best work when the deadline is looming. To which, if I'm going to be sarcastic, I say, no, you do your only work when the deadline is looming. But the point is that stress actually inhibits our brain function. And there are biochemical reasons why this happens. And the primary one is that stress produces different hormones in your body, and the job of those hormones and chemicals is to limit the amount of blood that goes to your brain and your internal organs so that that blood can be sent to the large muscles. Thus, the fight or flight result that we see when we're under stress. If you're frustrated about your inability to produce the kind of results you want to produce, if you are consistently under stress and or believe that this kind of stress is natural or even productive, then these are some symptoms that you may need to take a closer look at your own productivity management and begin to take control of your own productivity rather than deferring to your boss for productivity guidance. That leads us to a discussion of what a new mindset might be. And so I'll talk about a few ideas that may help you develop the kind of mindset that's going to enhance your productivity rather than inhibit it. New mindset. First, you need to lead and manage yourself well because of all the reasons that we've talked about. Nobody else really knows how. If you're a hardcore knowledge worker, nobody knows how to manage your work. Nobody knows how to define it. As in the example of my wife in the kitchen, I don't know how to define the best way for her to make an apple pie because she's an expert and I'm not. So think about having a mindset of leading and managing yourself well. You'll likely need to set up your own system to track and manage your tasks and attention because you're the one that's defining the work. You're the expert on how long the work's going to take. You're the expert on the priority of the steps. So that's another part of the mindset that you'll need to develop. And thirdly, I'll say, make sure that you understand that stress and associated deadlines is not a good motivator. It really inhibits our ability to do knowledge work in the sense that it inhibits our ability to apply our brains to a problem. Where we have lots of stress in our lives, we're hyper alert to things that may be going on, we get distracted more easily. We feel the weight of other things and we don't give each individual step its due attention. So as we're thinking about this productivity mindset, lead and manage yourself well, get some tools to track and manage your work and your productivity, and recognize that stress is not your friend when it comes to producing high quality knowledge work. As you adopt this new mindset, you'll see certain results in your world. You'll see an increasing level of calmness, an increasing level of a feeling of control over your work. And that leads to both better focus and thus to greater productivity. Now, at this point, I'll bring in one of the primary challenges, which is if you manage your own productivity, you're going to have different kinds of conversations with your boss. And remember, your boss is struggling to recognize whether there's a motivational problem or a skill problem or what's going on in your work. But your boss's responsibility is for the organization to produce results. If you're going to your boss and saying things like, well, I just have too much to do, then it's easy for the boss to interpret that as a motivational problem. And we've talked about the reasons why the boss might default to that thinking, whether it's true or not. Developing skill in how to have these productivity conversations with your boss is going to be very important. And again, developing that trust in both directions. So you need to be able to say to your boss, hey, boss, here's where I am in this process, and I think this step is very important to a quality output, and have a conversation about the boss's input on whether or not that violates some other constraint that the boss is aware of. But being able to have a professional, calm conversation with your boss about these things is going to be a very important skill to support this new mindset. But the result will be this increasing level of calmness and feeling of control about the work that you're doing for your organization. With the new mindset in place, you'll need a couple of tools to support that new productivity mindset. So you'll need to, when I say tools, I'm talking about processes, I'm talking about IT tools, computerized tools, I'm talking about your whole bag of tricks when I say tools. The first thing you'll need to do is to figure out a tool to help you create and maintain a backlog of your work. Understand that not everything can be done now. And when you make a decision to not do something until later so that you can focus on what you're doing now, you'll need to keep track of that because it's still something that needs to be done. And keeping track of it has very little to do with trying to remember it. It has to do with getting it out of your head into a tool where it has a more quasi-physical reality, where you can metaphorically touch it and deal with it and move it around. Figure out how to create and maintain a backlog for your work. Tool number 2 is figure out tools to help you capture your thoughts or ideas or new tasks in real time as they occur to you. If you don't do this, then those ideas will lodge themselves in your brain and they'll come back up at unpredictable times. The way you can tell if you're doing a good job of this is there's no longer a need to sit down and generate tasks lists every morning. The to-do list will become a part of the tool and a part of the backlog rather than something that you need to spend time doing every day. And we talk about to-do lists in other episodes and the kind of failings of to-do lists, but the primary one you want to think about is it's probably a waste of time and it's not going to be a terribly accurate representation of the work you need to do today. Tools. 1 is figure out how to create and maintain a backlog of your work. 2 is figure out how to capture your thoughts and ideas out in the world so that they don't lodge in your head. And 3 is you'll see yourself not needing to create to-do lists nearly as often as you did before because the work will present itself to you out of this backlog tool set. This episode has been about the lie that people believe that bosses control and enhance our productivity. Some are working on it, some aren't. We argued that it's our own responsibility to manage our productivity in concert with our boss and in tight, open conversation with our boss. Some believe this lie, others don't. You got to figure out what your situation is. So we talked a lot about the history of organizations and sort of the trend of managerial thought as it evolved hand in hand with the evolution of business organizations, particularly large ones. And we talked about Adam Smith and the specialization of labor, and we talked about Henry Ford and the factory mindset. and how that influenced the nature of work and thus thinking about the management of work. We talked about the fact that the growth of knowledge work as a huge component of our economy has changed all of that, has really changed the underlying assumption of the tools available to manage employees and how to deal with the boss-employee relationship. We talked about some symptoms that you might need to engage more heavily in managing your own productivity. We talked about this new mindset and the result of adopting the new mindset of needing to lead and manage yourself and of needing to do the work required in order to become good at leading and managing yourself. And then we finished with some ideas of a few tools you might want to consider. Again, tools is defined broadly, meaning systems and processes for better dealing with the fact that new things are coming into your life all the time. So we'll leave it there for today, but think about your mindset. Think about those symptoms. And to the degree that you feel those symptoms, stress, feeling like you're not able to produce quality work, then dig down into that a little bit and begin to think about the things that we've discussed in this episode. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.